Hi everyone, welcome. This is our fourth N.A.W event. If you've just joined us for the first time, welcome. We've been doing a month-long takeover with the Architecture Foundation. And this is our fourth event where we decided to do a reading group of 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School by Frederick. And the reason we decided to go with a reading group format is because in N.A.W we've had regular reading groups in the past 18 months. And I think I can speak for the group when I say that they've been really productive and incredible in building our own critical lens. And we've been reading different things from academic journals to articles and podcasts. So I think this time we decided as a group to create our own reading group. Just a bit about the book. I think for me and for the group, with 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School, it's one of those books that, you know, when you're a young student thinking about architecture, and then one of the first things you Google is, you know, architecture or architecture books. And I know for me, you know, it's one of the first things that comes up, and it's, you know, not overwhelming. It's not too academic. It's, you know, it kind of looks like a graphic novel in a way. So it's like really easily approachable if you're a student. And a bit of background about the book: it was first published in 2007, so it's been out for about 13 years. And I think to even read from the blurb, you know, it says here, like, you know, this is a book that students of architecture will want to keep in the studio and in their backpacks. It's a book that they may want to keep out of view from their professors. Expresses clear and simple language things that tend to be murky and abstruse in the classroom. And I think that explains really well the reason we wanted to go with this book is because it's very accessible. It's not full of jargon. It tries to break everything down. So yeah, I hope you guys, audience, enjoys listening to us talk about this book. And at the end, hopefully you guys could, if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to put it in the chat. It'd be nice to hear any comments, any questions, or even if you just want to come on and say anything, that would be really great. And with that, I'm just going to start by introducing ourselves as a group. So I'm Nasra Abdullahi, and I'm a Part 1 student, and I'm also a writer who's part of N.A.W. Shawn, do you want to introduce yourself next?
So my name is Shawn Adams. I recently graduated from the RCA, and I guess I've got interests in writing, speaking, and one day becoming an architect, maybe not with a capital A.
Iwa?
So hi, I'm Iwa. I'm a practicing architect in London. I am also a writer, and I also am an associate lecturer at the University of Manchester, the Manchester School of Architecture, and yeah, that's me.
Lois?
I'm Lois. Like Shawn, I recently completed my Part 2 at Central St Martin's. I consider myself a spatial agent and writer, and my thesis project looked at the power of comic books to kind of de-intellectualize architectural processes, and that's me.
Finally, Nana.
Hi, I'm Biamah-Ofosu. I'm a practicing architect in London, and I also teach. I teach at Kingston School of Art at second year level, and I teach at the Architectural Association at the diploma level. I am a writer, and also recently started a research project with my long-term collaborator, Bushra, looking at compound houses as an African typology. So that's a bit about me.
Thank you. So the way we've organized this reading group is into 3 different sections. So the first part, we'll be looking at the Black and Brown experience in architecture school. And the second part, we'll be looking at class and the cultural capital that exists within the space. And the third part, we'll be looking at skill. And each of us have picked 3 pages that we'll be analyzing through those lenses. And with that, should we start with part 1, with the Black and Brown experience?
So we've organised these, just to kind of elaborate a bit more about the way that we've organised this reading group. It's in these 3 chapters, as Nasra has mentioned them, is a way of critiquing what perhaps a book doesn't elaborate on. So for us as POC people, thinking about our own experiences and reflections in architecture school in relation to the book, there are obvious things that we think in 2020, in a new edition, perhaps could be covered more generously about what the arriving at architecture school looks like for people that look like us. And then the second one, talking about class and social capital, is really about acknowledging the fact that architecture inherently buys people a kind of social capital in the kind of creative space, and architects are trained to consider themselves as thought leaders. And actually what architecture school maybe neglects is that actually everyone comes with some cultural knowledge, and that actually some cultural knowledge is more highly regarded than others, and actually starting to think about how the culture that we bring to the architectural space is an important part of the things that should be covered in architecture school. And then lastly, looking at skill, but beyond the kind of traditional conception of skill within architecture. So actually other sorts of skills that make a good architect, and starting to perhaps think beyond kind of paper and pen, but actually also the other skills that are necessary to be a good architect, and perhaps better than good, a useful one to society. So without further ado, hopefully this all works. I'm going to share my screen, and the way that it will format this is by each member will call up the page that they want to kind of elaborate on, and we'll spend a few minutes kind of dissecting and having a conversation about that. So over to you, Iwa, who's first up. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Hi, I think it's number 37 first.
Okay, cool. So you'll also have to bear with me, guys. I wasn't clever enough to order.
I can't actually see this.
Can you see it now? Is everyone able to see the shared screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
it needs to, can it be?
I think maybe don't do full
There we
screen.
go.
Right, okay, that doesn't work. Good to know.
Can you zoom in a bit on the pages?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So any aesthetic quality is usually enhanced by the presence of a counterpoint. The reason why this one particularly jumped out at me is because us architects, we do a very good job at talking about, or kind of saying that we invite diversity. And I think this kind of whole series that we're doing this month is maybe kind of an example of how that's not true, just because this is something that doesn't really happen very often, and the fact that this is happening means that there isn't that diversity. But also, more importantly, in this kind of thinking about diversity, there is the understanding that there are certain facets of like culture, the communities that are accepted and those that are not. And that's what I really kind of wanted to hone in on by talking about this point, because there is the center, and we had an event called Drawing the Edge to the Center, and these peripheral kind of practices and these peripheral like groups are just as important, and it's not just the ones that we deem to be kind of good enough or acceptable. Yep.
I think based on that, for me, what's interesting there is the idea that there is a kind of, that architecture is driven by aesthetic, and that there's a need to center an aesthetic judgment or value. But maybe there's other ways of considering how we arrive at the aesthetics that we engage with in particular works. And maybe there's moving just beyond the kind of, we want a drawing that looks like this, but what does perhaps the aesthetic choices we make say about the projects we're designing or the people we're designing for? or sort of tell a story. And I guess in some ways it'd be interesting to maybe hear Lois's take on this, having worked on a project through a kind of graphic novel as a technique for talking about people and a kind of journey through architecture.
Yeah, so I think I chose the graphic novel as a medium in my thesis project because, for one, the premise of my project was about a kind of prison decarceration process, which is not a kind of thing that exists. So I really wanted to strike a balance between kind of some kind of plausibility, but also yeah, thinking about architecture that's not quite concrete in our like collective mind's eye. And I think essentially in architecture or in architectural studies, all what we're trying to do is tell a compelling story. And I don't think that traditional architectural drawings or the way that you present them, like orally or in written works, is it's not always that compelling. So yeah, that's why I chose a graphic novel.
And based on that, maybe we can also move on to your choice for this, Lois,
yeah,
with the effective well number 57.
Oh,
annoyingly.
the crits.
Yeah. So maybe you can just talk to us about that, because
57. Page 57. If you could get that up.
I don't think I've extracted it. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Let me just. I think I've got it online. Nearly there. Yes, here we go. So, page 57, or point 57, an effective oral presentation of the studio project begins with the general and proceeds towards the specific. So I kind of took this pointer as being suggestive of, like, you know, the crits and oral presentations that we're expected to do kind of continually throughout our BA and MArch studies. And yeah, I think the crits are very performative and emotional experiences, something that you're probably not used to as a BA student coming from kind of traditional primary education. And the feedback from the panel of guests is almost always like instantaneous. And it can be as instant as like a lip curl for one of the guests or like a crossing of arms. And yeah, just questioning the kind of like anxiety that's really inherent in crits, and like very, very unique from other styles of presenting. And I think they're like, crits are great because and necessary to a certain degree, because they're kind of like scaled down trial processes of like professional environments. But yeah, like questioning the structure, which has for the most part remained unchanged. Like when we conjure up like our, you know, mind's eye of the crit, there's always a front panel of males, predominantly white, who's kind of the lens that they come at is kind of, yeah, about architecture with a capital A. There's not necessarily any kind of tangential voices. So yeah. And I don't know, like, I think the crit really favors people who have had like an upbringing in being able to speak autonomously and confidently on their own, and then there are kind of questions that come from, like, you know, primary education. If you're disadvantaged, you might have come from a school where you're in a class of 30 and it's really hard to have an individual voice. So yeah, it's all of the skills that are kind of admired and encouraged in the crits, I think are taken for granted and they don't necessarily come that easily to people of colour or those from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Yeah, I think when you reference architecture with a capital A, I think it kind of goes really well with my page, which is page 83.
Okay, just bear with me while I crack that up. Not very great on the tech today, guys, sorry. There we are.
Yeah, so all design endeavors express the zeitgeist. And when I first read that, I thought, like, what does the zeitgeist mean and whose zeitgeist is it? I think zeitgeist in German means spirit of the age, that is in the definition is on the page. And I think, whose age is it? Whose spirit is it? You know, like, I think when you go down, when you really think about it, it's only one timeline that's applied to architectural history, formal architectural history, architecture with a capital A. And a lot of it, as we discussed in our first event during the Edge to the Center, a lot of it is the formal practice of architecture, you know, is since the 15th century, is essentially kind of European, the modern understanding of architecture. And, you know, even on the page where it says, you know, ages are divided into ancient, classical, medieval, Renaissance, modern, postmodern, you know, that is, it's not universal. And I think we always have to remember that somebody's universal is somebody else's local, and vice versa. And that's why, for me, the more I research and study about non-European architecture, you know, that also means, you know, non-European history, way of life, being, etc. There isn't really a worldview. It's all based on multiplicity of views. And that's why, for me, going back to the Black and Brown experience, a lot of the time I think you can feel alienated because you don't really see yourself or your culture's understanding of history or being or living in the profession or in the education, because you're socialized quite differently in your formal education, like, you know, up to 18. But yeah, I think for me, I'm always wary of like applying universal worldviews to everyone, because it's, you know, not every culture views history in that way.
I think linking really nicely to that is my selection for this part, which is number 45, which is so number 45 describes 3 levels of knowing: simplicity, complexity, and informed simplicity. And I'm adding to this embodiment and memory. And I think linked to Nasra's point is the idea that, for me, this description of three levels of knowing doesn't necessarily take into account somebody's experience, the things that we inherently know because we've experienced them. And that's what I mean when I talk about the kind of the embodiment. So how does architecture, as we remember it, how that plays a role in designing. So I think for me, the addition to this page would be adding embodiment and memory, because I think that's where you can really, as a person of color, start to bring your own direct experiences of space to architecture, and that not all knowledge is book knowledge, or not all knowledge is one that's written. I think it's also really important, as we try to kind of make architecture more inclusive, it's really about understanding that other cultures perhaps record their history in a very different way or experience space in a very different way. And part of that is allowing space within the classroom for non-white designers and students to bring that inherent knowledge to the space, and that actually, on the level of knowing, embodiment and memory are also really important tools as a designer. And I hand over to Shawn, who gives our last bit on the Black and Brown experience. So,
Right, so I'm number 6.
Number 6. Right. Bear with me while I call that up.
Oh, no worries.
So number 6.
So number 6 says here, we move through negative spaces and dwell on positive spaces. And I think if you kind of read the text underneath it, is speaking of very kind of architectural, tangible spaces. So well, the first thing that kind of came to mind was when you're like a dark alleyway, you want to quickly kind of run through it to get to a more brighter or illuminated kind of space that you feel safe in. However, if we kind of think of this as like intangible spaces and we kind of relate it back to our first event, where we talk about the edge and the center, what is a negative space and what is a positive space? Because if you feel like you're on the periphery, maybe going what appears to be a positive space is actually a negative space for you, because in architecture school you'd think like the positive space is the space where you're the person that's designing something that everyone kind of appreciates and everyone likes. However, when you kind of bring your culture and your identity into this space, it becomes a negative space because it's not necessarily appreciated. So for me, it was quite interesting. Well, whilst I'm not kind of given an addition, I think it's interesting to think what is a positive space and what is a negative space if we think of kind of like intangible spaces where people kind of operate in the field of architecture.
Also, maybe in addition to that, in terms of positive and negative spaces, the kind of figurative but positive and negative spaces in kind of what Nasra was saying and what we're talking about in architecture. So the kind of positive spaces would be this kind of European canon of going from ancient Greece to kind of postmodernism or whatever, and all the kind of peripheral kind of architectures of the world form that negative space, which isn't really marked out in this kind of Western kind of education in architecture.
So to kind of summarize, as we move on to our next sort of delving into the reading, talking about class and cultural capital, I think for all across all the 5 that we've sort of honed in on and wanted to really study, it's really about, I guess, experiences that are left out of the sort of tried and accepted architecture sort of knowledge, and it's about allowing space for somebody to bring with them their own kind of cultural understanding of space. And I guess linked directly to that is a topic on class and cultural capital, because one cannot really talk about these things without understanding race and class and culture as a holistic thing. So we start with Iwa talking about on page
80, well, number 86, manage your ego.
86, so, okay.
But also maybe we should kind of say a few words about culture in general in the kind of growing up for kind of underrepresented backgrounds, in so much that some of the references that are kind of pulled out in your BA are not necessarily things that I knew about kind of before going to architecture school. And I think that's something that's not really understood very well. And kind of now that some of those cultures are now being kind of integrated into architecture in terms of like urban culture, there is this kind of I'm in this weird kind of situation where they're the references of my youth that are kind of starting to come into architecture, and still people allude to like Shakespearean plays and things like that, which is kind of a weird situation that we're in at the moment. But okay, manage your culture. Okay, this is one that jumped out at me because, I mean, I think 100 people in the last month about their egos, etc. But this one kind of talks about managing it and understanding that there are places in which you assert your ego and places in which you don't. And I think this is something that I really wanted to kind of push forward, because it's something that I've seen architects do kind of in university when they come up to a crit and they say, I was walking down the street and a leaf fell, and that inspired me to make my building this way. which is just like, what are you actually chatting about? Like, there are restrictions, there are requirements from the client that make your building kind of a certain way, and you have the responsibility to steer the design of your building to the best option, kind of thing. But that is where your egos come in, and that's where your expertise is kind of needed. But yeah, I don't really.
I wonder.
Saying leaves fell and that inspired your building is probably not where you should assert your ego. Go ahead, Nasra.
I just wanted to quickly mention something earlier when we were doing the promotion for this event. Somebody actually messaged somebody slid into our DMs on Instagram and actually asked, I'm a builder. Can I join this event? And I thought, like, firstly, I thought, of course you could. Like, you're a builder. Like, you've actually, you construct, you make, you're practically almost an architect, right? But I thought that question came from perhaps an insecurity in terms of, oh, architects are the center and stage. They're the stars. My labor isn't as valuable as an architect because, my profession isn't the master craft. It's not as cool as an architect. And I think that goes back to your comment about the ego, Iwa, where, I think this is definitely changing now. I don't think it's cool anymore. Cool in this era of young architects too. I see you doing.
Fingers crossed.
I don't think it's cool anymore to want to be, the one genius in the studio. And it never was like that anyway. There was always people who were working behind the scenes, doing the shadow work. It's always a collaboration. But yeah, I just wanted to make that comment.
But also, it's like that kind of reminds me of that statistic that's kind of going around, which I haven't fact checked, so don't at me anybody, where they go like 2% of like construction work is overseen by architects. Just like that is like, if there's any kind of indignation or thing that stops us from like pushing around our egos, it's got to be that, exactly. Right?
I mean, the majority.
Also, sorry, go ahead, Nasra.
No, I was just going to say the majority of architecture constructed in the world is vernacular, and it's not even made by architects, designed by architects.
Like last week, we had Alice Condor from Dean Journal, the basic kind of premise of Dean Journal is this kind of following around people that don't consider themselves to be designers, which is amazing. But okay, maybe I've taken up too much time. Let's move on.
I think that conversation is really rich about the kind of, the role of the architect, and also perhaps really feeds in nicely to Lois's selection here about the points of view of architecture. And talking about part of, I guess, managing your ego is accepting that there might be different points of view within architecture. So I wonder if, Lois, you wanted to elaborate a bit more on your choice here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are 2 points of view on architecture. But I think this point really talks about like the 2 branches of inquiry that are promoted at BA level, which are, so sorry, I'll just read these out. 2 points of view on architecture. Architecture is an exercise in truth, or architecture is an exercise in narrative. And yeah, just like if they're speaking to these 2 branches of inquiry that we have at BA. So in the first sense, we talk about like and explore spatial forms, which is kind of the form of space, its aesthetics, and kind of those aesthetics speaking to the function of a building and how we use it truthfully, whatever that means. And then spatial practices, which is what we do in space and how our experiences and rituals inform design. And yeah, I just thought it was kind of curious how these 2 points seem like mutually exclusive when I don't think they necessarily should. And if there's kind of talking about like truth and whether that's like how that's explored in like aesthetics. Well, that's always subjective, so that kind of seems like redundant. And then spatial practices is also a subjective experience. So yeah.
I think that really links nicely to some of the things we were just talking about in our first chapter about the kind of brown and black experience of architecture, and this idea that the 2 points of view is still characterized quite largely by a European or Eurocentric understanding of space, and how space is experienced or relates to the human condition. And I guess, for instance, I'm looking beyond just the kind of European context and looking at more vernacular architectures that are built without architects, but built for very specific conditions and people. There's an idea that there's no universal truth, right? So how do we start to, how do you expand these points of views of architecture to include those and bring those in? Very good question. What's true? And is there architect's role to define what truth is? Is that really in our remit? And are we serving the society that we aim to if we impose what we think truth is?
That's the question, isn't it? That's it. Like, truth, I think, exists definitely outside of our remit. You know, and this kind of propensity that people kind of impose architecture on people, it's just not the one anymore. And yeah, that's it. That's all I've got to say. I'm going to mute myself.
No, I think this is I'm going to move it on, because I think we could spend hours talking about this. And actually, I think we'd love you guys to continue the conversation online with us. Tweet, slide in our DMs, comment on Instagram using the hashtag 101things, and yeah, so we can continue having this conversation. But I move on to Nasra, who has picked page 48. I love this one. You're muted, Nasra.
Sorry, everyone. So if I read it out, it says, if you can't explain your ideas to your grandma in terms that she understands, then you don't really know your subject well enough. And when I was researching for this event, I came across a really good study by Jennifer Chamberlain-Payne, who I'm not sure if she's an architect, but I'm going to assume she's an academic because she did a study. And she did a study on the value of cultural capital. So outside of looking at the dichotomies of advantage, disadvantage, working class, upper class, etc., she looked at the value of cultural capital and the role that plays in socializing children in their formal education years up until the age of 18. And she looks at 2 American architecture schools. And I thought, when I was reading this study, I thought, my God, I never really thought about cultural capital in that way. I never thought about, like how that informs your experience in architecture school or in art school and many creative spaces. Because a lot of the time when you come from a background where, your school wasn't, or your borough wasn't funded, the arts weren't funded, you lack in that cultural capital, you lack in knowing how to move in these spaces and knowing the language and the weird jargon that is associated with these spaces, and learning about art history. And I think a lot of the time what can happen to students, and I can speak for myself here, is that you kind of feel alienated in the beginning, and you don't really know how to maneuver your way, and you don't know how to I think sometimes in architecture school, and I say this privately with my friends, is like a lot of the time students have this thing where there's like the illusion of intelligence, and a lot of students are like really good at and I think it's a defense mechanism, we all have, of like pretending to know what we're talking about. But I think
the fake it till you make it.
Exactly. But I think sometimes, and there's always some element of pretentiousness and snobbery in all creative spaces, not just in architecture. But I think sometimes if you're a student who doesn't really know how to use that language and how to be inventive like that, and you don't have that cultural capital with you, it can be quite difficult. And I think this is definitely a class issue, not just a race one.
I think this is really interesting to me, and I love the fact that you brought this up, because when Bushra and I started our research project, I was trying to tell my dad about it and tell him, oh, we're looking at the compound houses in African typology, and he said, why? Like, everyone knows everything about it. But there's a kind of implied idea that some things are less valuable, that the things that your grandmother might know are less valuable or intelligent, and the idea that we could then discard something. But actually, Granny might be a really good source of information, first of all, about things we don't know, especially from cultures that are about passing down information orally. So while people like my dad will take the idea that the compound house is an African type very sort of slightly dismissively about the fact that why would that be of any academic interest? Because for him, that's come from all the histories of it, oral. And actually, that Granny is a very good cultural critic in that sense, because she can also fill in the gaps that are not in books, but also actually, very simply, if you can't explain a good idea well, then it's probably not a very good idea. And do we serve society if we can't communicate beyond the kind of hollowed walls of architecture school in language that everyone understands?
Exactly. And I think I wanted to end this part on Alice Grandois from Dean Journal last week, actually said something really very, sometimes you hear things that are like common sense, but it's still quite profound. And she said, everyone has an inherent skill to design. We all design in different ways. And just because it's not formally design, that doesn't mean it's design. So in that way, your grandma, the postman, etc., can have a say, and their opinion is just as valuable as a professional's at times.
And just to move on, for this section, I picked number 96. Because I thought this was really, for me, really interesting. And yeah, it's quite interesting to come across this. But number 96 says, summer people are 22 inches wide and winter people are 24 inches wide. And I found this really interesting because it makes several assumptions about who these people are and where they are in the world. And by making those assumptions, exclude other people. So the summer person, where in the summer, and also actually by suggesting summer and winter, it suggests already a location within the world, that not all people in the world experience summer and winter. So it propagates this idea that architecture is a kind of Western practice, and that architecture it's always framed a kind of Eurocentric, as a kind of Eurocentric practice. So I think for me, I picked this page because I think being specific in our design is really important. And so I disagree that summer people are 22 inches and winter people are 24 inches. Being specific to the region in which you're working, the context, will help you know what the dry season people are, or the Hamatan people are, or the monsoon season people are. So I think it's about broadening the scope of the areas that we work in, and also treating architecture as a very specific discipline to the place that it's founded, because at the end of the day, we're trying to tell human stories, and they're not only winter and summer in that regard, or one type of person.
I think you saying like it not being for like a particular or specific person kind of leads quite well into the number that I picked. So for this segment, I picked number 12.
I've got it.
And number 12 says, design an architectural space to accommodate a specific program, experience, or intent. And I think this is super interesting because I know, like, when I was studying architecture at BA level, you're kind of told, all right, this space needs to be like the kitchen, this needs to be the communal space, or this space needs to be like the kind of foyer or where people will kind of gather. And I think we're kind of increasingly seeing that trying to assigning a particular like function to a space is now having to change. And I always kind of go on about the youth club and the youth center and youth like community spaces. And if we talk about kind of class, like in terms of like working class spaces, a lot of these working class spaces they're multifunctional. So they aren't just a space that's allocated for let's say like young people to go in there. They're also used for weddings. They're used for funeral receptions. There's loads of different things that these kind of spaces can be used for. And then if you think of like more architectural kind of spaces, we look at a lot of informal spaces that don't necessarily or have a program, but people are using them in like interesting ways. Like, I don't know, Brixton Market, you'll see all these kind of like boxes all over the place, and you see everything looking quite chaotic. However, they function as a series of different kind of spaces and different kind of activities, as opposed to just saying, yep, you're gonna be here, and if you don't do this, you're out of this space. So I think that's something really interesting in culture, because like every culture is going to use a space completely differently to kind of so that they can kind of have their like personal experience in that particular area.
That's really interesting about the ways that spaces and the ways that we even suggest spaces through our drawings communicate a certain idea about cultural capital and who it's something's for. Because what I think, once you draw something, you kind of make suggestions about who it's intended for, and that then translates into, when it's built, who actually can use it. So if you look at, one thing that always strikes me is the use of renders, or kind of renders on hoardings to kind of propagate a future for that place. And if you look at a lot of them, there are hardly any Black people in them, especially in spaces like if you think about kind of London and the kind of edges of London, which are going through a kind of process of urban renewal or gentrification or whatever you want to call it. If you look at the hoardings with these kind of high-end apartments, they're landing in usually quite diverse places. The people in the drawings don't necessarily represent the people that live there yet. So it's a kind of erasure through representation in the very early days. And that could be as simple as somebody just didn't think about it on the drawing board or the Photoshop file they're using. But I think
it's also hard just to find Black people cut out PNGs.
Yeah, exactly. Well, why is it so hard? Are we in architecture? Like, nobody's ever thought, oh, it'd be really, yeah. Why is it such a struggle to find Black people?
I remember doing my renderings in third year, and like my Google search results were just like very suspicious, like Black person walking, Black person in pool.
Did you delete
Black person talking to minor.
I suggest you delete your search history though.
Yeah.
On that regard. But yeah, if you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're just about to move into our third and final chapter of our reading group. But so far we've talked about the brown and Black experience in architecture school, and also social capital along with class in relation to the seminal book 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. And we picked this book because it's one of the first things that most people come across when they want to study architecture, or if you don't come across it, somebody in your family will buy you it as a gift as a future architecture student. And it's kind of it's a very nice introduction into very practical lessons in architecture school, which are very, very useful. But our critique of it is that should this book be written in 2020, what does it look like? How does it encapsulate issues about race and culture and diversity and inclusion? And so as we move into our third and final part of this reading group, we're going to be talking about skill, and really trying to think about how skill adds to this conversation about representation and culture, and what architecture is and who it serves. So we start again with Iwa on this, and if you could just tell me what number. I feel like some sort of bingo master at the moment. So what's your number, Iwa? What are you going with?
Bingo. 76, please.
Great. So much fun. 76, yeah.
Yeah, so this is over design. And this goes follows on from maybe Shawn's point, in so much that there's like a certain megalomania in like architecture, and there's this understanding that you've got to design every last nook and cranny, and this point of over design maybe is something that I hope people in the future kind of maybe hold off on doing. I read something the other day that was kind of associating the profession of architecture to like a composer, or in an orchestra, in which you've kind of written the music and then you give it off to all these different instruments that then play this piece of music together, and it's better than anything that you could kind of imagine. And this is what I kind of want to put forward, more of an actual love or kind of respect for the collaborative process. Because in the end, like we can't design buildings in one-man teams. I think when we went to a certain exhibition at the beginning of the program, this architecture exhibition, I think a lot of us were kind of outraged by how, I see Shawn laughing, outraged at how the architect had not credited his studio at all, which is mental. It just people that have worked in the industry, we all know that that's not how things happen, and basically the studio should be credited.
Yeah,
that's what
I also think that question is really pertinent to the whole construction industry, because as architects, we don't, we're one very small part of the construction industry. We collaborate with builders, with engineers, with service providers, and the idea that actually it's an inclusive design process, not just with us within the studio, but actually within the whole wider design team. But also more importantly, I guess, and becoming much more center stage, is the idea of co-design or designing with residents. It strikes me as an odd thing that it's taken this long for us to get to a point where this is part of an architect's training, to be able to think about design as a collaborative, communal idea. And I think that has a very interesting relationship with the idea of over designing, and where do we allow other people space to contribute to the design if we kind of have this slightly megalomaniac tendency to want absolute control over everything. It reminds me of that Adolf Lois essay about the home he designs, and the architect designs with this, he designs everything from the slippers that they should wear to the space, and then gets upset that when he visits the home that they're not wearing the correct shoes. And it's that kind of slight megalomaniac.
Do you imagine that though? Like, you've just paid this dude to design your house. You've invited him over for dinner and he's like kicked off about your slippers.
Yeah. Actually, it'd be really interesting to hear from some of the architects, and I'm sure there are lots of us in the when we open up the Q&A, about kind of how do you let go of a design once it's done, especially I think working with private clients, where it's an exchange, it's a conversation, and sometimes private clients love to use it as a way of also testing out their own design skills. And when do you, what are the kind of boundaries? How do you manage that? I think
well, I mean, it's only kind of weird or kind of difficult if you look at buildings as something that you design everything up. You are giving over this space and this building to the client so that they can do with it whatever they want. In the end, it's an enhancement to their lives. Yeah. And I think not enough people know that.
Or are we the only ones that don't know that?
I think as you mean, as architects, as the profession, you mean? Maybe. Yeah. But I mean, we're getting, hopefully after this event, people will know that that's not how it goes.
Great, thank
I
you.
wonder if I just wanted to move on. I mean, I think it still links, but when we were planning the event, Lois and I picked the same page.
Yeah.
Page 101.
Yeah.
Which says, if I read it out, architects are late bloomers. And the first sentence is, most architects do not hit their professional stride until around age 50. And when I first read this page, I thought, okay, if we're still treating, you know, architecture as like the master craft, as something, you know, where the craftsman or craftsperson, artist is like suffering for their craft and is, you know, who can actually, firstly, who can afford that in this economy? Let's be honest. Because this really is an issue of about, you know, money and finance. You know, not everyone can afford to, you know, get their big break at age 50. That's, I don't think it's realistic in the modern era in 2020 and beyond. And I think I'm remembering now what the American critic Kate Wagner said in her Letters to a Young Architect that the Architecture Review did, where, you know, you are first and foremost a worker. You know, you're no different than, you know, the graphic designer or, you know, the person doing admin in the office, or, you know, you're all workers. And I think, yeah, that's what I thought about. Like, I don't think we should be, you know, suffering for our craft, and our passion shouldn't come from, and our love for this shouldn't come from us. You know, it takes so much work to produce these drawings, and the design process is very long, and it can be like emotionally and mentally taxing. And we shouldn't just be like suffering for it for the greater good, for the art. I think it's kind of outdated, to be honest, in the modern era. But yeah, what do you think, Lois?
I just don't think that this view is or has to be the way. And it's just interesting that it's positioned is the last point, 101. And I think it's like it's aimed to be like, don't worry, it's, you know, reassuring, like, you know, if you haven't found your feet in 3 years of BA study, like, you know, architecture is a long game. But I think it's just, it's just like a likely piece of advice given by architects who have, you know, they've turned 50 and they've been jaded and indebted by the whole architectural experience, and, you know, like this is a convenient piece of advice to give. And I think it also continues to support the idea that, like, architecture is this kind of like monastic pursuit towards like understanding and truth. And like, it just continues to support the idea of like
exactly
the master that knows it all, and then the student who kind of like has an awakening when they turn 50.
And it makes me question now as well, like, is your work as an architect, as a designer, only valuable then when you've mastered it? What happens in your foundation stages? What happens in between? Surely that is also, surely that is also worthy. You know, I don't think just because your work isn't like your magnum opus, that doesn't mean it has no value. And I think sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. But
while you're talking, Nasra, I'm reminded of I forget which Afrobeat song it is, but there's a lyric that I can't come and kill myself. And I think that's good to remember in architecture, that I can't come and die for this. Is something,
was it Davido? I feel like it was Davido.
I'll find it. I think it's a brilliant reminder.
Oh, someone said Burna Boy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Burna Boy.
How can I not have known that? That's really shameful. But I think it's a really important point, because I remember one of the first things that really struck me is, I think I discussed this in like second year, was the architecture awards and what's considered young was
oh my god. Sorry.
And I thought, oh wow, okay, well that's interesting. And I thought about it two ways. In one way, it means that, well, I've got a lot of time to be considered young, but also, do architects not have lives outside of architecture? Like, what about families? What about, like, do you have friends? Like, what happens? You know, and why 40 is kind of magic age? And then
but also this idea of like, if you somehow like of failure, like if you haven't kind of waited it out, then you've somehow failed in architecture.
And it's inevitable, like naturally in any craft that you do, in any profession you're in, you will naturally progress, you will naturally improve, you know, you will naturally master it eventually if, you know, you put the time and effort in. There's no need for, I think it's just this pursuit of perfection, I think, essentially, which is, I think, quite dangerous. And I understand and I agree with when Lois said, you know, it's supposed to be reassuring, you know, your craft is ongoing, progress is ongoing, but I think just the way it's stated is it's just not sustainable in the modern age. I don't think, again, like I said, in this economy. But yeah,
for me it's really interesting because earlier today I saw that Alicia from the BFA, Black Females in Architecture, tweeted that she wanted to nominate she wanted to make nominations for the upcoming 40 under 40 that's been run by the AJ, but the stipulation of age plus the need to be a fully qualified architect meant that people that she would consider as part, you know, having made a contribution and therefore deserving to be part of that group couldn't be part of that group. And that's exposed to the kind of limitations and this idea that you and Lois are talking about, the need to, by some age, have perfected it to get on lists like these. And actually that we should see architecture maybe as more of an ongoing work, and that the kind of final hoo-ha is not part 3. And, you know, there are lots of the kind of experiences of that, well, so what do I do after part 3? And it's kind of this, yeah, I got to the top of the mountain, but the view was a bit crap. And so where do you go from there? I think this is a really interesting thing to sort of think about, but I'm conscious that we're kind of running low on time, so I'm just going to swiftly move it along. But I think this is a really valuable point, and I hope that you guys will join us in discussing it more on through social media. So moving on, my points that I picked for this section was a sense of place, because for me, I think that there is a sense of knowing, and it kind of relates to the last one I picked about the being specific. And the sense of place comes from really understanding how to tell the story about a place, but it's not just in the kind of figure ground or so my one was spanning between the figure ground and the sense of space, and really thinking about these two things is really starting to think about how we experience space. And so the skill of being able to draw a figure ground is not the only way of describing a sense of place. And when you draw the figure ground, you're describing the sort of quite diagrammatically, but beyond the diagram, what are you telling your audience about the character of a place? So for me, there's a kind of, it's not a new point, there's an addition to this idea of looking at space and really starting to understand character, and that by understanding the character of place, we can start to tell a greater story about the kind of human condition, and in a very, very specific way. So that was my point on skills, to, in effect, to really look closely with a kind of critical lens, especially when looking at spaces that are unknown to the kind of Western canon of architecture. So I hand over to Shawn, who is going to give us the last one. So Shawn,
my point in number 67, I mean, it's very pragmatic. It's a very pragmatic point. It isn't really talking about some of the issues that we kind of discussed earlier, sorry. But if I just read it out now, it says a good graphic presentation meets the 10-foot test. I mean, mean, I don't think I've actually done this 10-foot test. I don't know how many people have done this 10-foot test before, but I do know what the book means in terms of when you're kind of strolling like around, or you see a crit and you're kind of taken back by like a really beautifully crafted plan or ISO or research drawing. But I think I kind of picked this one because I think now is such a like an interesting time, because how many of us will have the luxury of pinning up work? Like most of the work that we're seeing is going to be through a screen, and I'm sure if you did a 10-foot test away from your screen, you probably wouldn't see your screen. However, the point really is here is like these kind of unconventional ways of like showing your work. So now even if we could show our work and pin it up, now we're kind of increasingly seeing people use like gaming software. They're using like all these different mediums to kind of express and communicate their ideas. And I thought if I had to add something, it'll be good to kind of keep that open, because maybe in the future we won't see people drawing these big A0 drawings anymore. Maybe we're seeing more kind of digital mediums and zoom in. We might see more kind of VR. And I think that's like looking forward to the future is kind of exciting to think where architecture will like kind of go. And like people won't be assuming that all architects do is come with like a big blueprint of a building and then kind of like draw on a drawing board. And then, yeah. So I guess that was it.
First of all, has anybody figured out what a blueprint is and where they get that blue paper? Because I haven't seen one since I've started. And also, I mean, we've got to go back to kind of
maybe it's an American thing. I always assumed. If there are any Americans, maybe you could answer that.
Jane Patterson says old die line machines. Thank you. But also going back to that, we've also got to understand when the book came out. And I think that's testament to how far it's gone since, was it 2007? Yeah, people were still wearing flares back then, which is mad. So yeah,
I mean, flares are back now as well.
Yeah.
I think that's questionable, but I'll move on. Yeah, I think I'm quite excited about the changes that are happening in the last couple of years in architecture. It makes me optimistic for the future to come. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
I guess in some ways, moving from one mode of representation maybe creates a kind of level of inclusivity that perhaps isn't always available. I've been struck by the idea of, and COVID has done a really funny thing for me in terms of, there are lots of really good ideas that I just think, well, why didn't we used to do this before? So there was always, in architecture school, there's always the implied idea that you can go to every crit, but nobody really ever does, because as a first year, it's quite scary, right? You're not going to walk into a fifth year crit and like, hey, here I am. But you can sort of tune in remotely online now through their Zoom call or whatever. So it's sort of democratizing the space in some way. Or for instance, universities having their public lectures via Zoom mean that more people, you don't have to travel to a site to go be part of the event. Or also,
I mean, some of our events, you know?
Yeah. Also, in some ways, I found as students present online, they're perhaps more articulate and more kind of confident in the thing that they're talking about. Maybe just because they're in their own space, it's less scary to be in front of a slightly scary panel. And for me, much better these days, because it's unlikely to be three white men with their legs crossed looking at you, frightening the hell out of you. But there was also that. So these new modes of representation, while they might not fulfill the 10-foot test, do offer other ways of making architectural communication much more inclusive. So I hand over to Shawn to wrap up a little bit for us before we open the floor to Q&As. I realise that we're quite over time, but if anyone has any contributions, we'd love to hear them and just have a little bit of a chat about the things that we've discussed tonight.
I wonder if we take a few of the questions that I see in the chat before we kind of wrap up. I think I see a question from Chloe. Chloe, I look like I caught you off guard, Chloe. I saw you just kind of jump up. If you would like to ask your question, that would be great. Thank you.
And also, just on that, we do have we're very lucky tonight to have Matthew Frederick, who wrote this book as part of this conversation. So without putting you too much on the spot, it'd be great to have you contribute to this discussion.
If you want to, that is.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi everyone. I mean, my question was sort of a while back now. I can't remember which page it was, but I guess just it's really interesting that you guys have picked like a popular reference to critique from, or from the sort of new architecture writer's lens, and the idea of like critiquing, you know, Scaldabar or places where students get their PNGs for renders is quite interesting, because I guess normally this topic is around decolonizing academia or decolonizing the industry. So I think that sort of got me thinking. But my point was also about thinking in terms of like a feminist lens, in terms of, what was it? Yeah, the sort of the grandma page. Like, why is it grandma rather than grandparents? Like, there's sort of a suggestion there that grandma is less aware than granddad. So just sort of adding that to the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about the things we just take for granted in some ways, about how we use language in a way to sort of suggest things about the built environment. But perhaps, Matthew, if I can ask you to unmute, maybe to join the discussion. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're killing me. This is great. Thank you so much. Was there a question? I'm not even sure, but this has really been great. The grandmother point is really, really good. That really hits hard. And it's a great criticism. I probably was thinking, well, actually, I never met my grandparents, my grandfathers. I had two grandmothers. So I don't know if it was influenced by that, but even at that, that's clearly me just working from my own experience, not saying, well, how will other people read this?
Thank you for a very good book in terms of because I think just sort of reading it, kind of rereading again in preparation for this, we were all a bit like, wow, there's some really great tips here.
It's so great. It's like sound advice. Yeah. Even now, like I was reading things like I forgot about, or like I knew intuitively, but I had no idea there was terminology for it. But
or now know and appreciate retrospectively.
Exactly. Exactly.
I'm not sure how much of it I learned in school. A lot of it is I learned when teaching. I was teaching in a community college when actually a lot of the drawings in the book came from a handout I did for my students 100 years ago. And community college students, as you know, are typically the first ones in their family to go to school. They have perhaps learning disabilities, distractions with kids and so forth. And so I had to find a way to just boil things down to the simplest possible presentation, but not dumb it down. And write lessons that you could read 20 years later and still have them hit home for you.
Really interesting that you wrote this from a teacher's perspective rather, actually, because I think in some ways it sort of personifies the book, like the things that you couldn't have, you had to be sort of removed from and perhaps explaining to somebody else to be able to then write these really useful pieces of advice in some ways. And I wonder, I guess in some ways, you can't do it the other way. You really couldn't write this sort of book and advice from the situation when you're in it in some ways. And I think it's really interesting that you were writing this for a kind of community college audience, because they're probably quite non-traditional students to architecture. And this idea of, communicating to a wider audience and architecture is really important, because sometimes we do take that for granted. We take the kind of students we get for granted and who comes to us. So I think it's amazing.
Yeah, and it was both. Some of the lessons are, in fact, things that I remember my instructors saying directly to me. I remember the day they said it and what the room felt like and what it was like to have that light dawn on me. That behind me is my first architecture professor when I went to a community college. And I remember he told me windows look dark in the daytime. And wow, did my renderings look way better right after that.
It's amazing. I remember reading that actually earlier today, and I was like, yeah, actually they do. You just never think about it. It's not at the forefront of your mind, but I guess in some ways it's those very simple but actually really profound bits of advice that are super helpful in that way. So yeah, thank you for a great book.
Thank you. If there's a way to keep in touch with you folks, I would really love to.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I wonder if anyone else in the chat has any further comments, or perhaps we realize that we have taken more of your time than advertised. So like to.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone does have a burning question. Oh, Claire has just jumped in. Oh, maybe it's not a question.
It's a resource.
Oh, perfect. Well, I guess then we could kind of wrap up.
Hold on, sorry.
Jane's
just like come in with some fire. Can we
Jane
unmute
is my
her?
tutor from last year. I want to say hi to her.
Amazing.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Can we unmute?
Yeah. Co-host, so.
Jane.
Oh, you're muted, Jane.
No, yes, I've seen the unmute now. Thank you, guys. This has been a really interesting conversation to listen to. But a few of you have talked. I mean, I think Nasra's point about, architecture is good when you're 50 or you don't get to your peak to your 50s. That was really interesting to hear from your perspective. And I think the message for me would be it's a long game, so enjoy it. Said that in the last line. And yes, you're not going to get overnight success, but the important thing is to enjoy it from the outset. Anyway, I think you were talking about this being written back in 2007 as 13-year span. So I just wondered what Matthew would change in light of that comment and in light of recent events. Are there key things that Matthew would change if he was writing in 2020? I know it's a big question possibly for Matthew to answer, but given that you've said it, you're talking about it being written 13 years ago and things have changed. Is there anything, Matthew, you would change?
Are you speaking in regard to that last lesson about blooming at age 50 or?
No,
Oh,
not
just more general?
Just
because I would change that one to 60 now. You may, I don't know if you know, I have a series of these books now. I've written one on urban design, engineering, and so forth that I do with other experts. And so I've gotten better, much better. The architecture book to me is not the weakest, but it's below the middle of the pack now for sure. And I think
how are the others different then? If you're saying that you're getting better, how are they getting better?
Well, I've learned so much more about language, and I wasn't trying to be aphoristic when I wrote the architecture book. I was pretty much just saying what I said in the classroom, and I've learned so much about just the rhythm of language and what kind of words really stick with people. Also, I learned give advice in an active voice. So don't just say figure ground is X. It helps to say do this when you're in this situation. So yeah, things like that. And I don't have a specific example in mind right now, but I would
more nurturing, more sort of leading, or less...
yeah, more situational, I think,
okay.
Rather than here's a neutral fact, a little bit more situational. When you're in this situation, here's something to try.
Good, useful advice. Thank you. I enjoyed this whole conversation. And hi, Nasra. Really good to see you.
Hiya, thank you for coming. Good to see you as well.
You too. It's been a great session.
Mary Von Johnson, the comment makes a suggestion, maybe a future collaborative project between N.A.W. and Matthew. We'll be up for that.
I'd love to hear it.
Just to throw it out there. But yeah,
Shawn?
perhaps hand over to Shawn now to conclude for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to, on behalf of the New Architecture Writers and the AF, to just say thank you for everyone that's like engaged with us over this month or this takeover. Everyone that's joined us on Instagram for the Dominoes and the live, on Twitter, in the Zoom space, and I think for each of us is about not letting these conversations kind of die. So we don't want them to just be a one-off kind of takeover and then we kind of go back to all of the kind of issues or problems or the kind of normal things that happen in the architecture industry and in architectural criticism. We want to continue these conversations. We want them to continue to develop and people really get their voices heard. And I think that is really important to us because obviously we're now coming to the end of the New Architecture Writers program. So there's gonna, of course, be another cohort. But I think what's important to mention is that we are not disbanding anytime soon. Like we have started to really tease out some critical conversations and we want to continue this. So I think everyone needs to watch out to see what we're gonna do next. We got big plans. Like we got really big plans ahead of us. Like the spaces that we think we can operate in are definitely something talking points for everyone. And we just want everyone to continue checking up on the New Architecture Writers and the Architecture Foundation, because yeah, we'll have some very big news to announce very soon. Obviously can't really say anything yet, but it's soon to come.
You're such a tease, Shawn.
But just to conclude, thank you so much everyone who's joined us in this conversation. It's been really fruitful. It's been great to kind of have this session in a kind of public forum that we've used a lot through N.A.W. to really sort of build on our way of critiquing and writing and discussion really. And I also think at this point we should say a huge thank you to our tutors who have led those discussions, Thomas, Tom, and also Chloe, who used to be with us, and then left us with RBA. But it's, yeah, the conversations that we've had over the 18 months in these reading groups have really informed our kind of critique, not just in terms of how we perhaps write by learning from great writers, but actually also what we want to critique and what we want to look at and what's interesting to us. So we wanted this forum to be kind of a kind of window in to the way that we've worked in the program for the last year. So we really hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Matthew, as well again for coming.
Thank
Bye.
This is great. Thank you, guys.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.